Thank you very much, Ioana, for the invitation, and Dimitris for this very kind introduction. It's always a little bit embarrassing to listen to somebody else presenting your intellectual biography. But, sorry, my voice is not in its best shape today. Let me just say that I don't claim to be the conductor of an orchestra. I have endless admiration for conductors. But in what I'm doing, this is all about the network rather than the conductor. And Dimitris has been one of the earliest members of our network of citizenship studies experts who keep feeding this website that Dimitris already referred to, that I co-direct with two other colleagues whom I also want to mention. This is Joe Shaw in Edinburgh and Martin Fink in Maastricht. So I'm just one of these people out there who try to bring together and to network people who have an interest in citizenship and migration issues. Let me also say again, as Dimitris already mentioned, that I have several hats. I did a PhD in sociology, then a postdoc in political science, and eventually discovered that I really want to be a political theorist. And political theory allows you to ask normative questions that sociologists and political scientists say are not academic. But it forces you to ask these questions in a systematic way, not just because they are your political views. This doesn't count for anything, but because you think you have arguments in order to back up the position that you take with principles that are coherent with each other. So this is what I try to do as a political theorist. So I move back and forth between the comparative study of citizenship and the political theory of citizenship, and this is what I will try to do in this lecture today. Let me mention that it's obvious that this is currently happens in the context of a huge crisis, which is about refugees and refugee admission in Europe. It's not just a crisis of refugee flows as it is portrayed, but it's also a crisis of the European responses to refugee flows, and especially the lack of solidarity in Europe, not just towards refugees, but also between the member states in coming up with a European level response to this huge crisis. It's a real test for Europe. But I'm not going to talk about this tonight. Please bear with me. At the very end, if I get to that, if I don't talk too long, I will have some few very general remarks about European solidarity and how it links to what I've talked before. But the main topic of my talk today will be another deep question, which is not about just justice in the admission of immigrants and refugees, but justice in membership. So the question is, who has a claim to be a member of a democratic society? And that is a question that is puzzling in many ways. Political philosophers have debated it now for some time, because it leads to something that is called, let me get up, it's probably easier to talk like this. It's called the democratic boundary problem. So political philosophers like puzzles and paradoxes. And the democratic boundary paradox can be stated very simply, that when democracies take decisions about whom to admit as members, as citizens of the community, that presupposes that those who are taking the decisions are already members. So the question is, can they decide democratically about whom to admit as a member without raising the question, well, how have you become a member? What is the legitimacy of the demos that can decide on whom to admit or not to admit as a member? Oh, okay, thank you. You have all the technology here. This might work good. Thank you. So this is at the heart of what I've talked about, the democratic boundary problem and principles for accepting people as citizens. I will first talk about how political philosophers have tried to respond to this problem by coming up with certain inclusion principles that they think are democratic in nature, but that lead to very different implications of who has a claim to be admitted as a citizen. Then I will try to confront these theories a bit with empirical evidence. And the evidence will not be about refugee and immigrant admission, but about voting rights. Why that? Because in a way, democracy is about making collectively binding decisions on behalf of citizens and justifying this because those who take the decisions, the legislators, have been elected by the citizens, and all of the citizens have an equal vote in that process. So that's in a way the heart of what citizenship really means. It's one of the cores of citizenship. Who has the right to vote in democracy? And I will test the theories by showing that we find something that is quite surprising, that is not predicted by any of the prevalent answers in the political theory debate. So that, in the third part, then takes me back to theory, where I try to make sense of what we see, how democracies respond to the challenge of migration, both on the immigration side, that's important to keep in mind, and on the out-migration side. There is a strong bias in Western theories about immigration. They always think of the destination state only, and the migrant is always only seen as an immigrant. If you think about the position of the migrant, of course, the migrant is always both an immigrant and an emigrant. They come to places and they leave places. And the question about citizenship is also their connection to both the countries where they take up residence and the countries from which they originate. So you have to see how democracies respond by giving immigrants vote, but also how they respond by giving emigrants, those who have left, votes. In the third part, I present in a way my own little solution to this democratic boundary problem, and I hope to convince you. And then, in the end, I will say a few words, but only very sketchily, how this theory might apply to the European Union and might end up in some kind of political recommendations. So, the democratic boundary problem. In democratic politics, that problem comes up in different questions that are on political agendas. The most obvious one, I've already mentioned, is the admission of immigrants and refugees to the territory and the admission of newcomers to citizenship. And this is politically contested. It's sometimes on top of the domestic agenda. In electoral competition between parties, especially in Europe, this is one of the most contested issues that you can have. So it would be kind of embarrassing if democratic theory has no answer to that question, right? That's a very good reason for looking at it. Voting rights of immigrants and immigrants are another issue. It's maybe less politically contested, but it's a little bit closer to the heart of what it means to be a citizen. And then there are other issues that also have to do with democratic boundaries, such as questions of secession, state breakup, or state unification. Now we have a forthcoming referendum on Britain possibly leaving the European Union. If we take seriously that the European Union itself is a democratic polity, there is the question, what do member states have a right to secede? Yes, according to the Lisbon Treaty, there is a certain right and procedure to secede. How is that justified? Why is it possible in the European Union? Why is it not possible in Spain, where Catalans also held already a referendum that was not officially recognized on whether they can secede? So again, here is a question about the democratic legitimacy of certain ideas about boundaries. In Spain, they think the Spanish nation has an inviolable boundary. Nobody can secede from Spain. That's the constitution. In Britain, they think Scotland has the right to leave if a majority in the referendum in Scotland votes for that position. So what does that tell us about the conception of democracy that is behind these various ideas about boundaries? Now, this is real-world politics. In democratic theories, you mostly have two answers that I find unhelpful. One is to say that we can't resolve this boundary problem. We cannot say what is democratically legitimate in terms of immigrant admission or secession or these issues, because it always presupposes that we already know that the demos is legitimate who takes these decisions. And that we cannot know because, how can the demos justify this towards those who want to join or those who want to break away? So we just give up. And the answer is then we always start with what we have, and these are the existing boundaries and the existing right of states to exclude or to admit immigrants to the territory and to citizenship. This is a kind of conservative bias in this kind of response. And some people take exactly the opposite conclusion from what they think is the irresolvable boundary problem, and they say, since we cannot resolve the problem, democratic boundaries can never be legitimate. They can always be contested. Anybody can challenge them. If an immigrant wants to be admitted and the democratic legislator has no good response why that person shouldn't be admitted, that means the immigrant has to be included in a way in the conversation about the legitimacy of excluding them. So you get this contestability idea of democracy, which I do find important. That leads to more progressive ideas about the boundary, what the boundary problem really implies. But it also is in a way unsatisfactory because it doesn't tell you what the legislator in the end should decide. It just tells you there are people out there who can challenge your boundaries. It doesn't tell you what the right answer is to the challenge. So you still need some further thinking about the right kind of principles that will tell you this is a person who has a claim to a right to inclusion, and that is a person that maybe doesn't have a claim to inclusion, and how to distinguish between those. So, what are the answers that you find in contemporary debates in political philosophy journals? There are actually many more than the two that I want to present here. And then the third one is, in a way, my own little contribution to this debate. So one answer refers back to an old Roman law principle, which in Latin is quod omnis tanget ab omnibus approbetur. My Latin is a little bit rusty. But that means basically that what affects all shall be decided by all, right? Or shall be approved by all. That's the better translation, right? So the idea is democracy affects the interests of various people because it makes collectively binding decisions, right? And those people, and only those people, should be included in making these collectively binding decisions whose interests will be affected by the very same decision. Okay? So that is an old established idea of thinking about democracy. And one political philosopher, Robert Goodin, has taken it to its extreme conclusions. He says, first, this is really puzzling, you know. The idea, he says, is a bit like saying that the winner of the lottery will be decided by a lottery in which the winner itself participates. So there is a circular argument in there. His idea is that if you include all whose interests are affected by political decisions, then there is no stopping point. First of all, anybody who is excluded, by definition, has an interest that is affected by the decision to exclude that person. So, if you take a decision to exclude, you have to include the person that you exclude. That's just a way of restating the paradox, which means that anybody has a right to be included. And Goodin's conclusion is very straightforward. This is why there are no legitimate boundaries. Only humanity has a legitimate boundary, and even that can be contested if you think that intelligent animals may have claims to membership status against human beings. So we can only think about a global demos, and what we have, this world of states, is just a second-best world. States can only have derivative legitimacy if they see themselves as a part of the global demos that administers a certain territory and a certain people, but legitimacy comes from the global level rather than from anything that is a predefined and bounded democratic people. So that's a very radical conclusion. In this theory, you cannot make any legitimate distinctions between citizens and non-citizens, or between residents and non-residents. And this is what Goodin suggests how we should think about this problem. It leads you straightforwardly to radical cosmopolitanism. there is a second possible answer that says, no, maybe democracy is not about the affected interests, or not only about and primarily about affected interests. Democracy does something else. Democracy subjects persons, as Dimitris already said, right? It subjects persons to the laws. The laws have coercive force. Outsiders may be affected by the laws, but they are not necessarily subjected to the laws. They are not the people who are addressed by the laws. There might be side effects, of a law that anybody can claim is affected by who is outside. But the law in the territorial jurisdiction addresses specific persons because they are in the territorial jurisdiction. This is how the world is organized. And democracy is about making people free because they are subjected. That's the paradox, nicely stated by Jean-Jacques Rousseau in his Social Contract. The idea is democracy forces you to be free. Because democracy uses force, but the only possible legitimacy of that force is if that force makes you as free as possible. You need the force in order to resolve collective action problems. Otherwise we live in a state of anarchy where everybody does what they want in the state of nature. But if we want to have organized societies, we need some coercive power. But that coercive power must secure the freedom of the individuals whom it subjects, right? Okay, that's the core idea. So what we look at is subjection rather than affected interests. If you take that that stance, then the answer seems to be a quite different one. The world is organized into states, and states have territorial jurisdictions. So they subject people who are inside the territory and don't subject people who are outside the territory, generally speaking. So therefore, basically everybody who's inside the territory has a right to be recognized as a citizen, to make that person as free as possible and to make it legitimate that they are subjected to the power of the state. Right? Any person who is outside doesn't have that kind of claim, right? Because they are not subjected. They are not addressed by the laws. So that is one possible conclusion. And some people have said, well, this is how it should be. There's a Mexican political theorist who wrote a kind of pioneering article on voting rights of migrants who said, immigrants should always have voting rights, no matter whether they are citizens, but immigrants should always lose their voting rights. There is no justification in including them because they're not subjected. Well, but the same principle actually can also be used for a different argument. You can say, well, look at immigration control. What happens at the border? Aren't outsiders subjected to the force of the law when you exclude them? Isn't that also a kind of coercion that has to be legitimized in a democratic way? And if you do that, don't you then again end up with the conclusion that you have to empower the outsiders to be represented in the making of the immigration laws that will potentially exclude them in the end? This is another implication of that same approach that has been drawn by Arish Abizadeh, a Canadian-based political theorist, who said, yes, we need to justify subjection to the law. But that means immigrants actually always can challenge immigration laws, and they ought to be represented, ideally, in the parliaments that adopt the immigration laws before they enter. And this is not just an immigrant in front of your border, it's the rest of the world, because the rest of the world is potentially excluded by an immigration law. So you again end up with the global demos also in that version of the all subjection to coercion principle. Now, I find all of this very interesting but unsatisfactory, because you are stuck with this alternative. Either you justify what we have, the power of states to rule territories, or you end up immediately with the global level democracy that is wishful thinking. It's a utopia that I'm not even sure is a desirable utopia if you think that that has to go along with the world state. So, what is the alternative to this? The alternative to this is what I call a principle of including citizenship stakeholders. And that would mean that you think about democracy as being organized in bounded political communities that do have certain territories and boundaries of membership. And the claims to be included depend on an individual's link with a particular bounded community. And the link can be specified normatively. You can say that if democracy is about self-government, This is the core of the term, it's the rule of the demos. So it's the people collectively governing themselves. And for what purpose? They govern themselves because they want this particular democracy to flourish. They want, to develop it economically, culturally, social justice, etc. This is what democracy is needed for. If that's the purpose for democracy, then you can look at individuals and their relations to a particular community through the same lens and say that in order for democracy to govern itself, it takes that kind of regime. In order for individuals to be autonomous and govern themselves, they have to be recognized as members of a particular democracy. In order for individuals to flourish, like democracies want to flourish, they have to be recognized as members of a particular democracy. It's not like everybody has a claim to be a member anywhere. Individuals have life histories, they have biographies that connect them to particular places and societies, and they have claims to be recognized and included in those societies and in these places because their individual right to freedom and self-government matches the collective right of the community to self-government and freedom. They are mutually conditional and dependent with each other. So that's the basic idea of that alternative response of citizenship as a stakeholdership in democracy. Now, let me come to the second part, which is hopefully a little bit more fun, because I have some charts and diagrams to show that I puzzled about for quite a while. So, how does that, how do democracies actually respond to the immigration challenge when it comes to deciding who has a right to vote in elections? So let's imagine there is a demos, a democratic society, and it has elections, of course, and let's also just say elections happen at various levels, national level, local level, there could be a regional level, provinces in between. And let's just imagine there is no migration whatsoever. Then the answer, who has a right to vote, on my theory, not on Goodin's and not on Abizade's theory, is an obvious one. It's the citizens who are also the residents. There is no difference between the residents and the citizens if there is no migration. Everybody who resides in the territory is a citizen and the other way around. Okay? So, and now let's bring in the migrants. These are the immigrants. What happens if immigrants come in? You suddenly have a group of people that are non-citizens, right? But they are residents. They take up residence and they live in that society. And the same process generates emigrants. So you have a group of former citizens who have left the territory and who have kept their citizenship. So you have a group of non-resident citizens. And the challenge is now how to redraw the boundaries in that type of configuration. Right? So here is what democratic theories, here are four possible responses that come out from various democratic theories. One is to say that we don't care about immigrants. We have to stick to the boundary that we had ideally without immigration. So let's have an insular demos. Let's just keep the same black boundary around the resident citizens and exclude both the immigrants and the emigrants. Okay? One possible response. The other one is to say that, no, citizenship has at its very core the right to vote, the franchise, or the right to be elected. It doesn't make sense to say we have citizens who can vote and citizens who cannot vote. And since there are citizens who have left the territory, whom we still recognize as citizens, these are the persons, obviously, that should have the right to vote. So you deterritorialize citizenship by including the non-resident citizens, but you still keep it exclusionary on the immigration side by saying the immigrants, they can naturalize, they can become citizens, but as long as they are not citizens, they cannot possibly vote, because that is what citizenship means. How can we give them the vote if they are not citizens? There's, of course, another possible answer, which follows quite straightforwardly from what I said was the first interpretation of including all subject to coercion, which is everybody who is resident in the territory is subjected to coercion, therefore all the residents should be included. The boundary should be like this. But the immigrants, they may be citizens, but they have no right to vote because they are no longer subjected to the laws. Why should they be represented in the making of the laws that don't apply to them? Right? So that's the other possible answer. You deterritorialize. You territorialize citizenship again, but you include the immigrants. Now, you might say that a different approach, and maybe that also goes for the one that I've suggested, could make both arguments at the same time. And said, well, what we need to do is to expand the demos in both ways. The immigrants have a claim to be included because if they take up residence, they become citizenship stakeholders. You know, they are not just subjected in the laws, but their lives are tied up with the communities that they join. Therefore, their freedom and self-government and flourishing depends on how that society does. Right? Therefore, they have a right to be included. But also the immigrants, they don't automatically lose their ties to the country of origin. They maybe want to return, you know, together with their children who were already born outside the country. So why not include also the immigrants and go for an expansive conception of the demos that includes anybody who has a genuine link to that particular polity, right? And finally, you can have a fifth response, which is to say that we are talking about democracy, and democracies have the right to make laws that bind themselves. And one democratic theorist, Joseph Schumpeter, more famous as an economist, but he also wrote an important book on democracy, says, well, this is how it should be. How can we deny to a populace, how we call it, which is a demos, the right to determine its own membership? So, of course, parliaments can pass laws to say who is a citizen and who isn't a citizen. And democratic theory has nothing to say about this, except that Parliament should have that kind of power. It's just a matter of procedures and not of substance who is included, right? So you get these variations. Some democracies might go for an expansive boundary, some democracies might go for an insular boundary, some might go for deterritorialized, some might go for post-national. Anything goes, right? This is what democratic theorists tell us we will find in the real world. Now, what we've done in the EU Citizenship Observatory is most recently a comparative study of voting rights for non-resident citizens and for non-citizen residents in the EU 28 countries and in 19 American states. And what we find is something different. It's this pattern. You do find an expansion of the demos in national elections towards the immigrants, the non-resident citizens, but you also find an expansion of the demos at the local level towards the immigrants, the non-citizen residents. And both things happen at the same time, and they're very often combined in the same states. And that is something that is really interesting because it has been completely ignored, both by empirical studies of this and by the democratic theorists. And to back up this rather bold claim, I will just give you some actual empirical results from that study that we've recently carried out. So this map looks just at the non-citizen franchise. So this is now about the immigrants and where they can vote. And if you include the local level, which we do here, right, then of course red here is it's like for traffic lights, you know, stop, there is no vote here, right? North America and Central America are those regions where immigrants can never vote unless they become citizens. Right? In some countries it's easy to become citizens, like in Canada, for example, but that's the condition for voting at any level in any election. In Europe, there is no such country. Why? Because of the EU treaty. right? The EU treaty says that EU citizens who are not the nationals of the member state always have the right to vote in local elections. So you don't get the color red for that simple reason. But you get lots of different shades of colors. The color light green are those that stick to the EU treaty and said, this is where we stop. We allow the EU citizens to vote in local elections, and that's all, right? The color dark green are those countries in Europe, in the EU, which are 12 overall, that go further and let also the third country nationals vote in local elections. Right? And the countries that are light blue here are those countries that, in addition to these local level inclusions, also allow citizens to vote, non-citizens to vote in national elections. However, not all third country nationals, not all EU citizens, but only specific other nationalities. In Britain, for example, this is Commonwealth citizens and Irish citizens can vote. They can even be elected. They can be members of parliament in Westminster without having British citizenship. In Portugal, you have a reciprocity between Brazil and Portugal that makes it possible for Brazilians in Portugal to vote in national elections, right? In Ireland, again, reciprocity with Britain. So that's the European story. The most interesting story is about South America, where you have the greatest diversity. You have the extreme cases like Suriname and Central America, no right to vote for immigrants. But you have countries where immigrants can even vote in national elections. And these are three. This is Chile, Uruguay, and Ecuador. And Ecuador is the most recent and the most radical reform that has enfranchised non-citizens also in national elections. Okay, so that's on the immigration side. On the immigration side, this is how the map looks. So you find again some countries. Here we've coded countries as red cases, including this one. If they either have no right for immigrants to vote or if they require that immigrants travel back to the country in order to cast their vote in the country on election day. That's, of course, technically doesn't completely exclude the non-citizens, the non-residents, but it's a very high hurdle. It's not encouraging them to vote. It's not really expanding the demos in any great way. So here you have Ireland, Greece, Cyprus, and Malta as the four cases in Europe where there is really no major expansion on the immigration side of the demos. And you have some countries in Latin America as well. So, but the most interesting thing is if you look at the two things together. So here is a map where all the countries that we've studied seem to be dispersed. And that's again the no immigration scenario. So we start with the color red. And then we bring in the non-citizens, the immigrants, and cut out the countries that give them either restricted voting rights or give them unrestricted voting rights. And this is now taking together local and national elections. So, here you would have basically the EU countries that stick to the EU treaty for local voting rights and those that go further. Right? That, for example, include the third country nationals in local voting rights. Now let's do the same exercise for the immigrants. These are the most countries here. By the large majority of countries says citizenship is enough. You can vote in national elections even if you have lived outside the country forever. You've been born outside the country. You just need to be a citizen, right? And there are other countries that restrict that right to vote from abroad because they have residence conditions. You must have been born in the country, or you must have lived in the country for a certain time, or you must have wished to return to the country or whatever. Right? So if you combine now the two things, right, this is what you find. You find the large number of countries that is in the green area that has actually an expansion of the two types that I showed you before, right? That do expand both voting rights towards the immigrants and voting rights towards the immigrants, but they generally do it in differentiated ways Immigrants at the national level, immigrants at the local level. Right? So this is the story that we find that confirms our initial hypothesis. Now, let me take this back to democratic theory. Initially, I suggested that the principles that are debated in the theory of including all affected interests, all subjected to coercion, and all citizenship stakeholders seem to be incompatible. They come up with different answers to the democratic boundary problem, right? So you have to go for one or the other answers. I found this is also the position that I initially defended myself. I wanted to promote my own little principle, stakeholdership, against the others. Right? But eventually I realized it doesn't make sense because, the other principles have such a strong intuitive moral appeal. How can you say that democracies should ignore the interests of those that are affected by democratic decisions? Right? So I said, okay, you have to make these principles compatible with each other. They have to be seen as complementing each other rather than as alternative answers to the same question. So you have to find the three questions that are answered by the three principles. Right? And this is my suggestion how we can understand this. Who should be included if their interests are affected by a democratic decision? Those that are affected by the decision that is taken. So this seems to be a principle that is about including interests in policy decisions and policy deliberations. It's about the output of democracy. It's not about the input of democracy. It's not who has a right to be represented and to vote and to make the laws. It's about what the lawmakers should think about when they make the laws. Who will be affected by the laws? And then they have a moral duty to take these interests into account in the making of these laws and maybe include those people in their deliberations. It doesn't mean that these are the very same people that have the right to elect the lawmakers. That's just a non sequitur. It doesn't follow. If we fix that principle as being about the policy process. Right? Okay? So that's my reinterpretation of all affected interests. How about all subjected to coercion? How can we resolve that conundrum that it seems to be on the one hand only about those who are inside the territory, and on the other hand it could also be seen as including the rest of the world because the territory has an exclusionary boundary where coercion is exercised. Right? So how can we deal with that problem? I think the right answer is to say that all those who are subject to the jurisdiction of the government have a claim to equal protection of their rights and freedoms by that government and a right to contest the government. If you look at the 14th Amendment of the US Constitution, that's one of the famous amendments in the post-Civil War period, right? It says it has a number of different clauses. The first clause says who are the citizens of the United States, and that's very simple. Those persons born in the United States or naturalized are the citizens of the US. So there's a reference to birthright and to naturalization. And these are the citizens. And then it goes on and says, and everybody in the jurisdiction of the United States has a claim to equal protection of the law. So there is a distinction that is being made between who has a claim to be a citizen and who has a claim to be protected under the law. Right? And my interpretation is, if you are subjected to the laws have a duty to protect you, to protect your freedoms, but the laws must also be contestable by you. You must be able to say that, I defy that law because it restrains my freedom. The right to protest, for example, the right to form parties, the right to stand up against government cannot be an exclusive right of citizens. It has to be a right of anybody who is subjected to the law. But it does not follow that anybody and only those who are subjected to the laws have a right to be citizens. It seems to me rather absurd to think that those who are outside the border who want to get in have a claim to be citizens before they get in because they are coerced by the law. That is just a paradox. It's not a plausible political answer. The answer is they have a right to justification. They have a right that the laws be able to tell them why they are excluded, why this might be necessary. And it's not absolutely, impossible to provide that answer. Very often it's not possible. Then they should be let in, for example, if they are refugees. But this is the claim that they have. It's not a claim to be represented in the making of the immigration law. It's a claim to be able to contest that law and to be given an answer when the law excludes them and coerces them. And finally, I repeat my own principle as the one that answers to the question, who is claimed to be included as a citizen. So that's in a way the solution my solution to that boundary problem. What you have to do is you have to sequence these three questions and to apply them to separate domain of democracy. Sequencing means you have to start with citizenship. You first have to find out how the demos is legitimately constituted. And my answer to that is the demos is legitimately constituted if it includes all stakeholders, right? Those whose lives are tied up with the with the flourishing and self-government of a particular polity, right? This is what you need to do first. And then the demos establishes or authorizes a government, through the democratic process. That government has coercive powers. That government exercises, subjects people. And those are the people to whom the government has to respond when it subjects them by providing them with protection, by justifying and by providing them with opportunities for contestation. And finally, the legislators and the government produce an output which is policies. That must be democratically legitimate. And the primary criterion for democratic legitimacy of the content of the policy is whether all the interests that are affected by that policy have been represented in the deliberations of the legislators when they pass that policy. Or whether they just said, no, this is, we only take care of the citizens and ignore anybody else there who will be affected by our policy. That makes the policy democratically illegitimate, right? But it does not mean that anybody out there has a right to elect the legislators. So that's in a way the solution that I suggest. And I tell you, it's too neat to be true, right? I first thought, okay, this is it. But of course, you cannot stop there, because democracy is a fairly complex thing. And there are tensions that are built into that very argument. If you look, for example, if you think again about policies and how it works in the real world of democratic politics. Okay. The citizenship stakeholder principle would, the dominant principle I just said is that policies ought to track and give voice to all affected interests, the policy decisions and deliberations, right? But, this is a normative claim. In the real world of democracies, of course, it's only certain voices that are really strongly heard because they also elect the government. So there is an alternative view of who should be represented in the making of the policies, and this is the democratic people, composed of the citizens. So the alternative view is, no, also policies should just track the will of the people, and this is the end of the story, right? And there is another view, for example, that you could say, no, policies should actually track the common good of all who are subjected to the laws. And this is the primary task of policy. So you end up again with a difference between the three conceptions. And I think they're actually linked to different images of democracy. The first one is a fairly utilitarian image. People have interest anywhere in the world. You try to aggregate the interests, and this is what the outcome of democratic policy making should be. The second one is a liberal image of democracy, where democracy provides protection and freedom and autonomy to individuals, but you don't think so much about the democratic accountability of the government, and self-government is something that is an illusion anyhow. You just want the rule of law. This is what liberals care most about, right? So this is what liberals want. And if this here is basically a Republican idea, that people should be able to govern themselves, therefore these people should be included. But if you follow through the Republican logic of this, you end up also with these ideas, that this is also a part of democratic legitimacy, right? that the policy should track the will of the people. So this is just saying this is where ideological contestation happens, and none of these ideas can be completely confined to its respective boxes, as in the previous table. They will come out of the boxes and say, no, this is really about the citizens and only the citizens, right? Or it is really about everybody who resides in the territory. And then you have it out there, and it has to be fought out in the agora. This is all you can say, basically, but guided by the normative ideas that come out in these diagonal solutions. Okay, so that's in a way the first part of the theory, which is about the inclusion principles, and that's all very abstract. And I want to follow up on this now, on this arrogant claim. So we've seen that, I've suggested that there are these three principles for democratic inclusion, and each one is valid, but in a different domain. And in the membership domain, which includes voting rights, in my idea, it's about citizenship stakeholders. Now, in the real world, what we see is, and this is what connects it to the previous slides about the national and local voting rights, that membership principles membership rules are very different. At the national level, what we find everywhere is membership is based on birthright. All of you got some citizenship at birth, apart from the very few exceptions who are born stateless. Right? And then later on in life, you may have an opportunity to change your citizenship, maybe acquire another one in addition to your birthright citizenship, or you give up your previous citizenship and acquire a new one. But this is a change that comes after birth. The basic regime is that it's attributed at birth, and the presumption is it's for life. It's not, you don't lose it because you stay abroad for too long. You keep your citizenship status. In most cases, you can even pass it on to the next generation. So it's a very strong birthright principle that goes into how states determine who their members are in practice, right? Even Aristotle, the first great theorist of citizenship, when he thought about this, first said citizenship is about ruling and being ruled in turn. But for practical purposes, we determine as citizens those who are descendants of two Athenian parents on the father's and mother's side. So he was aware that there is this disconnect between the ideal of self-government, member in the self-governing community, and the necessary practical determination of membership through, in his case, a very exclusionary jus sanguinis principle where you have to be descendant on both sides, right? But there is an alternative to this, which is citizenship just based on residence. You can imagine, and we actually do find polities, not states, but polities in the general sense, where all it takes to be a citizen and to vote is to be a resident. So the dark green countries in that map on voting rights of immigrants are those that say, at the local level, you are a citizen if you are a resident. And we don't care about where you have been born and who were your parents. National citizenship is irrelevant for local citizenship in those countries. That's a different membership principle. And since at the local level you vote, it means there is a form of democracy that exists there. And in practical terms, since cities don't hand out passports, you can say citizens are those who show up in the voting register, right? Those who are registered as having the right to vote are, for practical purposes, the citizens at the local level. And residence is a very strong principle there in many of these democracies in Europe and America, as we have seen. And finally, you have a third principle that I call derivative citizenship, which is saying you are a citizen because you are also a citizen of another polity that is nested with the polity we are talking about. To make this less abstract, the most obvious application is the European Union. I am a citizen of the European Union because I'm an Austrian national. That's the only reason why I can claim citizenship in the European Union. Residence doesn't matter. My descent doesn't matter. My birthplace doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is I am an Austrian citizen under Austrian law, and therefore I am also derivatively
a European citizen. This is how the European Union determines who are their citizens, but it's not just the European Union. You find the same principle, for example, in all federal states. If you think about federal states have regions or provinces or cantons that are also democratic polities, where elections are being held. And in nearly all cases, the principle is you can vote in the regional election if you are a national citizen and a resident in the province. Right? So it's a derivative citizenship. It's derived from national citizenship or federal level citizenship and activated by taking up residence in one of the provinces, just as it is in the EU. There is a structural analogy between supranational citizenship and subnational citizenship at the regional level. And funnily enough, we call both of them regions. You know, the EU is a supranational region, and the sub-state entities are also very often called regions. And the interesting thing is the same idea of derivative citizenship applies to both. Okay. So let's then look at how these different rules of that operate at different levels. So again, what I've just said is you have polities of different kinds. We should not think as states as being the only level where democracy happens. You know, democracy happens at many different levels, and these polities have different membership characters determined by how they determine who their citizens are. States do it by birthright. Municipalities within states, not universally, but in a large number of states, do it by residence. And suprastate and sub-state regional polities do it by deriving their citizenship from the citizenship of the anchor polity, which is the state of which they are members. Right? Okay. How can so this is also that it can be linked to rules that you can determine as legal principles. So for the states, the rules are birthright that comes in two varieties, jus soli and jus sanguinis. You can be a citizen by birth because you're born in the territory. You can be a citizen by birth because one of your parents was a citizen. Nowadays, unlike in Aristotle's time, it's only one of the parents, and it's either the father or the mother. It used to be for a very long time only the father, and that was successfully challenged by the women's movements in the 1970s, and eventually overcome in most democratic states as an exclusionary form of jus sanguinis. And then you have these corrective mechanisms where you can acquire a new citizenship through naturalization or lose a citizenship through renouncing, through giving it up. Municipalities, there's just one rule. It's based on residence, ideally in that type, and we can call this jus domicilii, you know, the right of residence, rather than the right of blood or the right of territory. And with the derivative polities, we have either upwards derivation or downwards derivation. There are no good Latin terms for this, so I just invented these. Upwards derivation happens in the European Union, from the member state to the Union. Downward derivations happens in federal states, from the federation to the provincial level. Right? Okay. So for the normative theorists, the question is there any justification in this? Is there any reason why it is like this? Can we make sense of it? And my answer is, this may seem surprisingly conservative, yes. This is a structure that actually can be defended on grounds of pluralism, a plural arrangement where people are simultaneously embedded in all of these regimes. And it's the difference that counts and that makes it interesting and democratically justifiable. Rather than thinking like the political philosophers who say it can be only one principle and it has to apply across the board. That's the only one that we defend. I think we should think about democracy in a multi-level way, where the levels apply the same principle of who is a stakeholder in the polity in different ways. They give different answers. And why is that? Because the polities themselves have different environments and different capacities and competences. So think about what it means to be a state in the environment that is called the international state system. It means that there is no higher authority. There is no suprastate out there, generally. And it means that people who move in that environment across international borders are extremely vulnerable. International migrants are not like internal migrants because they are outside the territorial jurisdiction of the state whose citizenship they carry. What they need for that reason is that they can retain that citizenship, even though they are no longer subjected to the laws, in most cases, and can carry it across borders, and that the other states have to respect them as foreign nationals before they offer them, would you like to become a citizen? So, and that has to be a voluntary choice in that system. It cannot and should not be an automatic imposition. There is one theorist, a colleague of mine at the European University Institute, who said, democratic inclusion is so important that we should force immigrants to become citizens. They shouldn't have the right to refuse naturalization. We just give them the passport. Now you're a voter. She made a big concession, which is you can keep your citizenship of origin. We don't care about this, but we want to include you now. And I think this is not right, because in that international environment of state, international migrants must be given choices about their affiliations, and the choice means to renounce the citizenship of origin or to keep it, to adopt a citizenship of destination, or to remain foreign nationals because maybe they want to return and this is their orientation in life. To make them free as citizenship stakeholders in the transnational space, they need this kind of citizenship regime that is actually based on birthright. So we may think about birthright as being something very exclusionary, but for most international migrants it does make sense because it helps to protect them in this kind of environment. Municipalities are in a completely different environment. They are embedded in states, and here we are talking only about democratic states. So they are embedded in states and they have open borders. There is freedom of movement inside the territory of democratic states. So it does not make any sense for municipalities to say that you keep your citizenship after you have left the territory. Right? If you move your residence from Athens to Thessaloniki, you can no longer vote in elections in Athens. Oh well, maybe there are you shouldn't.
The second level, the municipalities within states, this thing does not count here. I mean, what happens in Greece is exactly that the level of the municipality is the level with which judges citizenship. So you're a citizen in Greece because you belong to a municipality, because you are registered at the rolls of a municipality. So once you're registered, no matter where you live, no matter where you've been, no matter where you go, you vote for your municipality where you are registered. Inside Greece, of course, yeah.
That's also a question, why not outside?
No, but even if you're outside Greece, you're still registered at the municipality where your parents have registered you. So it's not jus domicili. This is what the...
So maybe my answer to that would be, well, I would see this as a deficient system. I think there is a very good reason why municipalities should automatically include all those who are residents and automatically exclude all those who are no longer residents. Without offering them external citizenship. In some cases, it happens even across the border. In Latin American states, you're registered in the city. We don't give expats voting rights, but if you come back, you can still vote in that municipality. I think this is that doesn't differentiate in the right way between the state level and the local level, which I think is important for democracies to do. So. What's the justification of the system? I think on the state level, the justification for migrants, I've already said, it protects them, that birthright citizenship. For democracy itself, it also does something very important. It creates an image that there is intergenerational continuity, that the people is not just composed of those who happen to be co-residents at any point in time, but their birthright citizenship sends a signal, right? It's a signaling device, as the sociologists would have it, right? That says you belong to a community in the long term and for life, and therefore you ought to think, for example, about the interest of future generations, right? and not just about those who are here for the time being. Right? But that, of course, has an exclusionary side to it. You know, not everybody can belong to the same community in that sense. So therefore, it's very important that you have a second level where these rules don't apply. Where the borders are open, where residence is the basic principle, and where mobility is enabled through that principle, where local municipalities and cities can cope with endless diversity. You have very few states that have a majority of immigrants in their populations, but you have many cities where that is the case. And cities still work. City governments work. They can cope with huge diversity generated through mobility if they have a conception of their own citizenship that is just based on residence. Right? So this is a way how inside the society, you know, you can have open spaces of citizenship that are enabled by jus domicilii. And finally, for the unions, the way I think about this is that derivative citizenship is a glue that helps to stick together a union that can potentially break apart. Cities don't secede from states, but regions might secede from states. So how do you keep federations together? And Britain might secede from the European Union. How do you keep them together? By saying that the citizenship in the union is connected with the citizenship of the constituent entity, the member state or the province, right? And the two belong together, and it's like a contract. You know, if the one level can be sufficiently free and autonomous and self-governing, then they have an obligation not to break up the union at the other level, but only under the condition that the other level gives them the freedom to govern themselves and doesn't turn into a centralized government that takes away that freedom. Right? So that's in a way the federal contract. You know, autonomy for the provinces allows the federation to govern itself, and the federation, if it no longer guarantees that autonomy, risks that the provinces will say, well, we want to govern ourselves as independent states. And this is the story, you know, why if that contract no longer works, and there's a serious risk that it will no longer work also inside Britain between Scotland and England, and inside Spain between Catalonia and Castilla, then this is a violation in a way of that idea that the two citizenships should be interlinked, and there should be a measure of federal solidarity in there. So I'll come to my quick conclusions. I've talked for much too long, but these are some ad hoc policy prescriptions. This is not the most important part. Please don't think about political theory as generating policy proposals, you know, for consultation with legislators. That's not the point. But I think there are some. I also want to do theory that connects to the real world. So I think there are some implications that follow and can be defended on that ground, and that would be that member states in the EU ought to give access to national citizenship for immigrants through residence-based naturalization and jus soli. So that would throw out national citizenship regimes that are exclusionary by saying, oh, we give special preference to those who have the same ethnicity, or we subject you to an income test, or to a strict language test, or to a test whether you've learned by heart the constitutional principles, and we pretend that that tells us something about your values, which is, of course, nonsense, right? So all of these additional criteria beyond residence, I think, are suspicious from that kind of perspective, because by being long-term residents, immigrants become stakeholders and have a claim. They should be entitled to become citizens, rather than the political community being free to determine whether or not they get it. And that is also a straightforward argument for jus soli, which Greece has fought for very hard since the last reform, and has now introduced in a modified form that I think generally does the job of including the second generation born of immigrant origin at the age when they attend primary school. But it doesn't exist in many other member states, you know, that have strict jus sanguinis principles that exclude second-generation immigrants and pretend they have to naturalize, you know, and declare their consent or their intention to be members of the society where they have been born and grown up, which is a violation of their stakeholdership, which is different from that of first generations. Dual citizenship is an issue that has been attacked also in political theory. They say, how can you have two voting rights in two different states? But if you think about it from a genuine link perspective in the international system of states where states are independent, it makes complete sense to say you have a claim to vote and be represented in two different countries, and that country should also offer you two citizenships. As long as the countries are not unified in a global world state, that's not a problem, because there is no level at which your two votes will be aggregated in electing a single government. Right? And then I think the point of my theory is not just inclusion, but also legitimate exclusion. Under that theory, unlike Goodin's and Abizadeh's, there is a stopping point when states should no longer offer citizenship. It's not the rest of the world that has a claim to be included. It's particular people with particular ties. And that means states should refrain from offering citizenship to those who don't have these ties. One example would be a practice that is developing rapidly, which is now called investor and Olympic citizenship. Investor citizenship is the citizenship that you can buy if you're willing to pay or to invest money. There was a big debate in Europe about the case of Malta, where the Commission and the Parliament intervened and said, since you're also handing out European passports, not just Maltese ones, but they are European passports, you cannot do this unilaterally without the consent of the other member states. And the Commission also said, EU citizenship should never be for sale. It shouldn't be a commodity. This is what they said, right? Which I found brave. It's not entirely backed up by the European treaties, but it's a strong statement. How you should think about the link between EU citizenship and member state citizenship, and they interpreted this as a violation of this implicit contract that goes into the derivative structure. I think also that there is a problem on the immigration side if citizenship is transmitted endlessly to generations born abroad. There are many countries in Europe that do this. There is no stopping point. And if the same countries also tolerate dual citizenship, it means actually you can have fourth and fifth generations who will still have the passport of a European country of origin that comes with privileges to be admitted to the European Union, that are not justifiable on grounds that they have stronger links than anybody else who wants to get into the European Union, and the right to vote in elections inside the European Union, which sometimes actually tempts politicians to send people there, campaign in Argentina for the next Italian election, and try to get one or two mandates and seats out from that campaign from people who have no interest in Europe otherwise. So that is over-inclusiveness that is problematic for democracy. And finally, the practice of several European member states to offer citizenship privileges on ethnic grounds rather than on stakeholder grounds is also highly problematic. Okay. So what can the EU do? Since it's an exclusive privilege of the member states to determine who their nationals are, I think the EU could still promote some kind of convergence of standards, as it did in the Malta case, for example, by saying we have certain constraints of what we think is still acceptable within the spirit of the European Treaty, even if not the black letter law of the treaty. And this is why we try to encourage member states also for reasons because the EU has an agenda of harmonizing immigrant integration. And immigrant integration doesn't come up in most of the EU documents that talk about this, as if integration stopped, before naturalization happens. Naturalization is a core part of immigrant integration, and therefore the Union should have an interest in promoting at least some coordination between the member states on this. And finally, the EU has a much stronger stance when it comes to taking away citizenship. There is a famous case decided by the European Court of Justice, the Rothman case, where the judges said states have the power to give citizenship, but they have not a national power to unilaterally determine to take away citizenship if they also take away EU citizenship in that very same act. because somebody, who has a EU passport and moves around in the Union, and suddenly a member state says, now we take away your passport because you have been abroad for too long, would be obviously violating a basic principle of what European citizenship is good for, which is freedom of movement. So there is a much stronger stance on constraints with regard to citizenship laws. So that's with regard to citizenship status. With regard to voting rights, my conclusions would be that member states ought to give national voting rights to first-generation immigrants, to those who have left the territory. I think this is a huge democratic trend. I haven't shown you the time series, but if you look at how many states granted voting rights to immigrants after World War II, I think there were 5 or 7 or something like this, and today it's the vast majority of democratic states around the world that have some kind of inclusion of the immigrants. And I've tried to explain why there might be justifications for this trend. It's enabled by technology. You have Skype, you have email, you have frequent flyer, you have cheap air travels and things like this. That makes it possible for people to be connected, even if they are permanent residents abroad. And states respond to this by including their immigrants, and that makes complete sense. But as I said before, there is a limit to this, and here with voting rights, I suggest the limit is already with the second generation. The second generation inherits citizenship by birth for good reasons. As long as they are minors, they must be able to travel with their parents. The parents take the decision whether to return or to stay in the country of destination. And this is why they need the same citizenship as their parents. But citizenship, voting rights, they don't get at birth. There's a difference between citizenship status and voting rights, which you get at the age of majority. So for the second generation, the question is, if somebody who has spent all his life or her life for 18 years in a country where they were born, and they happen to have inherited the citizenship of another country, should that person still have the right to vote in democratic elections in that country of origin? I don't think so. I don't think this makes sense. If the person decides to return, to take up residence again, then they become first generation and are no longer second. And then they can retrieve their voting. No, exactly. This is the difference that I make. Citizenship can be legitimately passed on to the second generation and should be phased out for the third. Voting rights are never passed on. They are not inherited. Voting rights is what you get as a citizen at the age of majority. The first generation keeps it because they got it at the age of majority. The second generation should not get it. They shouldn't acquire voting rights if they have spent their whole life until adulthood abroad, because that does not connect them to the polity in a stakeholder sense. That would be necessary for me to make it legitimate that they vote. Okay. Then there are also conclusions for the EU, but maybe I shouldn't go into too much detail there. I think there is a problem in the EU currently that member states, some member states, Britain, Denmark, Greece is one of them, actually punish freedom of movement by taking away your right to vote in national elections if you move inside the EU. And that's contrary to the spirit of what the EU citizenship is about, and the Commission has said so very forcefully. And they said, this is something, we don't have a hard law to go after you, but we think you ought to look into your immigrants' voting rights, at least for those who move inside the EU. Right. So, is that all we have to say? That looks like a very modest package of reform proposals.
Sorry,
yeah.
Can I go back a little bit to the previous slide?
Yeah.
So we're talking about voting rights of the immigrants, including facilitating these rights. We're talking about facilitating these rights. We're not talking about just allowing people to come back to vote, because this makes a great difference in my eyes. Yeah. We're talking about facilitation of this right. I mean, organizing something for you in order to make it easier for you to vote.
Okay. So there is a much bigger story. I'll try to keep that short. Here I'm talking about the boundaries of the demos with just eligibility. Can you vote? And in Greece, technically, you even are eligible to vote if you are a non-resident citizen.
Come back and vote.
Exactly. But do states also have a duty to facilitate your right to vote, which would mean granting you, for example, the postal ballot, that you can cast your vote when you're outside and send it back by mail to your country of origin. Here I think political theory should stop. It has to, because theory has to be general. And that is a question that is about context. It's not a question that I would have the same answer for all states. Why that? Because some countries might say, we have a huge diaspora out there that can be easily mobilized and that might outweigh the domestic votes in some cases. And we don't want to exclude them, but we don't want to facilitate their mobilization in a way that the resident citizenship population would feel we are dominated by a vote that comes in from abroad. So I would find it legitimate. For example, the Irish are now debating this, right? If Ireland says we'll enfranchise first-generation Irish immigrants abroad, but maybe they have to vote at embassies, right? Rather than getting an electronic vote or the mail ballot. That I would find justifiable under the consideration what's the right balance between a large diaspora and an internal population that feels that the diaspora should be included. But
in
maybe
practice,
not
this is what happens here, even though it's not said.
Yeah.
I mean, we recognize voting rights, but we will not facilitate because we really don't know what will happen if all these guys come to vote here.
But Greece has a specific problem that in the constitution it says that immigrants have the right to vote, but the implementing legislation has not been passed. This has come up in the Strasbourg Court of Human Rights. The final decision was to let Greece do what it does, right? But I think it's slightly problematic because I think it would not hurt the Greek democratic process if there were some opportunities for first generation Greek diasporas to cast votes, but it does not mean that they have been paid travel airfare to come back or given electronic voting, for example, as they would have in Estonia. Or in Switzerland now, which makes it very, very easy to cast your vote. I think there is a legitimate concern how to balance the weight of the diaspora vis-à-vis the domestic population. And anyway, the cutoff point with the second generation minimizes the problem in most cases. Okay, so back to the beginning, which is democratic inclusion is not only about membership. There are these other elements, which is the possibility to contest coercion and the inclusion of affected interests. What can we say about this? And this is the only comment I want to make about the Greek double crisis. Right? I think if you think about let's first consider briefly the EU debt crisis. It's obvious that affected interests are all over the place. This spills hugely across borders inside Europe because of the common currency, right? So these interests are deeply intertwined and interdependent. What's the right answer to this in the democratic process? The right answer cannot possibly be that it's basically the European Central Bank plus an intergovernmental process that decides what the solution to the debt crisis is. I think there must be a parliamentary element to this, which cannot be just each parliament decides separately whether we let the Greeks, get away with it or impose some further restrictions or whatever. It has to be an interparliamentary process. So my ideal from the very start of the crisis would have been basically to have a process that involves the German Bundestag and the Greek parliament, where actually parliamentarians are involved in discussing the right solutions to that crisis, rather than just the heads of government and the Troika working this out amongst themselves. I think this is what the affected interest principle means. It means deliberating jointly in a way that the citizens are represented in the policy decisions, right? And that obviously hasn't happened in that kind of crisis. You can, of course, come up with excuses and say, well, there was the urgency, there is the financial markets out there and their reaction if this is debated for lengthy parliaments. There are all sorts of risks. But I think the basic principle is fairly clear that taking seriously the inclusion of affected interests requires a different kind of democratic legitimacy. And that process didn't have full democratic legitimacy for that reason. And I think the same thing basically, Now, let's think about the second principle that I also embraced was everybody subject to coercion, has a right to be protected in their freedoms and to be able to contest the coercion. So if you think about this in the context of the migration and refugee crisis, it basically means that the decisions that are being taken must be justifiable towards the refugees in the first place. These are the addressees of the exclusion policies or the inclusion and admission policies. So there must be some justification, not because their interests are affected, but because they are actually subjects of coercive power of the state, which is a much stronger thing than having one's interest affected. And that means, again, it cannot be just the member states coordinating their interests among themselves. The basic question, especially with regard to refugees, is always, what's the impact for the refugees? And if the impact is there will be, again, in the thousands, numbers of people drowning in the Mediterranean as a consequence of closing certain migration routes in Europe, this is a very, very weighty argument that kind of coercion is hard to legitimate from a democratic perspective. Because you risk, if you deliberately risk in the huge way the lives of people that are not your citizens. They don't have a claim to be your citizens before they come in. But they have a claim that they are protected in their life and in their freedom if they are subjected to your coercive state power. And that is something that needs to be the starting point. There is a second element in that refugee crisis that has more to do with this element of political union, and this is solidarity between the member states. I think it would be possible. There is no perfect solution to that crisis. There are only second and third best solutions, but the best solution that is possible in Europe has to be a European one. It cannot be possibly one that is worked out by member state after member state, trying to pass on the buck and shift the burden. So what can you say? The European Treaty has a clause that is called the Sincere Cooperation Clause, right? This is basically the solidarity principle in the European Union treaties. Sincere cooperation has been violated all over the place in the response to the refugee crisis. There was no sincere cooperation. There was insincere cooperation. And I refer also specifically to my own country of citizenship that, by organizing this conference with the Balkan states, not inviting Greece to the table, and saying our main interest is to close the Balkan route because then we will be shielded from the future refugee flows. This is, and the Commission has said it, it's not just me saying it, this is violating the spirit of the European treaties. States are in principle under the existing law free to determine their own policies for immigration and for refugees, but they shouldn't be completely free to violate their duties of cooperation inside the European Union. And this is it. And I've talked for much too long. So thanks for your attention.